This is Mike McMaster recording today from the Wood County Committee on the Aging um, in Bowling Green. And of course, I work at the Wood County Museum. The building that you see in front of you is the Wood County Museum. Of course, before that, it was the Old County Home. And I have worked at the Wood County Museum now going on 22 years. I've driven all across Wood County. I have researched many of the historical stories and people. And in those 22 years, I've seen artifacts and buildings and people. And I have some of my favorite artifacts and stories. And just like Julie Andrews had a few of her favorite things, the title of this project is Mike's Favorite Things. And this is part two, Mike's Favorite Prehistoric Fossils. Now, the story begins when Pemberville looked very much like this old 1908 postcard. And I won't just let this postcard get past us. That is Front Street. You can see the horses and buggies and wagons and the people on Front Street, with the object in the center hooked to the overhead electric. That was the interurban. The interurban was not a streetcar. It was a vehicle that was quite large that could take you from Cleveland to Cincinnati at speeds of 50 and 60 miles an hour, you along with 50 other passengers. Now, actually, Pemberville, Ohio was a hub at that time of railroad and interurbans. Marked by the red solid lines were the Toledo, Fostoria, and Findlay running roughly north and south, and the Lake Erie, Bowling Green, and Napoleon interurban railroad running from the northeast west. Now, both of these interurbans were merged into the singular Toledo, Fostoria, and Findlay. The interurban never made it all the way to Napoleon, Ohio. But it was also where two rail lines, the Hocking Valley, shown by the orange dotted line, and the Toledo and Ohio Central, both of which are no longer companies anymore. That is also where Pemberville was a hub. Now, the story begins with the Pemberville Press, the newspaper of Pemberville, on Friday, October 9th, 1896. And on the front cover of this newspaper, highlighted there in red, was a newspaper article that piqued my interest. And that article stated that the remains of a mastodon found in Wood County were on display in the window of F.A. Saxby's drugstore. The writer of the article goes in to inquire, how were these found? And thus the story begins. Now, they were found in Webster Township, near Scotch Ridge, on Swan Road. Now, the story begins in the Pemberville Press that about 5 years ago, I guess about 1891, was unearthed on the Blasey farm while excavating a ditch at the depth of 13 feet. And the depth of that ditch also piqued my interest. I'll tell you why. They were laying a tile ditch at 13 feet. Now, of course, I went to Overman Hall at Bowling Green State University. That is the Department of Geology. I knew in their collection, actually from many, many years ago, that they had these Wood County mastodon bones in their collection. And with that collection was this photocopy of a typed out story that differs slightly from the newspaper and handwritten across the bottom, probably a mastodon known to have been abundant between 25 and 75,000 years ago. Nobody knows who typed this up. Whoever made the photocopy only photocopied the front and not the back. We'll never know where this story came from. Now, these mastodon bones at the very bottom were found on the Fred Syke farm off of Swan Road. The red line at the far west, the left of this, that is State Route 199. Fish Road runs north and south. Alexander at the very top of Section 17 of Webster Township. Now, the hand-typed note states about 1884, Mr. Blasey decided to reclaim some of the swamp land by means of a ditch, and they stated it was a tile ditch. Now, this is a modern topographic map of Section 17, and you can see that there were two swamps about 40 rods apart, divided by a rocky hill. So that red outline with the arrow shows Hill 695. On the other side of it shows perhaps the two swamps. Mr. Blasey had to tile those two swamps at the north part of his property south to Swan Road. He could not tile them into his neighbor's property. There were ditch laws. And his tilemen had to somehow tile through that hill 695. That is why they were at such a deep depth. The hill, they said, was a rocky hill, which had the appearance of having been a shoreline shape, with the edges well-rounded. The rocks were smooth and of a flat appearance. Now, the people of Wood County knew that there were fossils in the limestone, but the description of this hill is not limestone. The fossils that they found were not in the limestone. They were not that old. And they were found at a depth of some 13 feet, which fact precludes the probability that they are the bones of a Leviathan. Now, I do not know what the writer necessarily meant by this. They were not in limestone. The rocks were smooth. It was a shoreline. Perhaps it was a sand hill. Leviathan could mean whale. I'm not sure. But to an old Frenchman, the chief ditcher, belongs the credit of the discovery. The old Frenchman stopped the laborer in front of him from swinging his pick into the bones and identified them as mastodon bones. Now, in the United States, people have been digging for mastodons since Charles Willson Peale in 1806. The note at Bowling Green State University, which is different than the newspaper, states that when the old Frenchman and Mr. Blasey dug carefully and brought out these bones as you see them here, of further excavating, to my knowledge, no attempt has been made. Now, Charles Willson Peale excavated an entire mastodon in the year 1806. That mastodon in its entirety is on display at the Smithsonian now. Mr. Blasey had took them and had them on display at Saxby's drugstore in Pemberville. And the report is that Mr. Blasey had several times refused handsome sums offered for the bones by the collectors of relics of antiquity, and he never parted with them. These are what they discovered. These are 2 leg bones and 4 spine bones. The white and that rod are plaster to stabilize these prehistoric ice age bones. And what else did they find? Mastodons, as we know, are much like elephants. They found part of a mastodon tusk. Now we say to ourselves, these bones are the spines, the tibia, and the perhaps tip of the tusk. What is a mastodon? Well, we know they're very similar to what is modern elephants. They are smaller than an African elephant, and they are smaller than the much larger woolly mammoth. And you can see the person there. So we can show how big they are. He's about ready to be trampled by a mastodon, African elephant, and mammoth. That is how big they were. Now, we do not know who wrote that note. The story on the note at Overman Hall is different than the newspaper, but the bones are at Overman Hall today in their collection. You cannot go into their collection and see the bones. That is why I went there. I was allowed to take photographs. I have shown you what you normally would not be able to see. Were they successful in tiling 13 feet through Hill 695? You tell me. This is the farm today. It is solid trees and scrub. I suppose that I'm standing on Swan Road looking north. If someone were to go through there, perhaps you would find the remnant of that hill, that rocky shoreline that they attempted, I suppose, and failed to tile into the ditch at Swan Road. That is the last slide that I have. I hope you enjoyed this program.